On the night of December 27th, 1989, during an opening show for Aerosmith, Sebastian Bach was struck directly in the head by a glass bottle thrown from the crowd. Blood, shouting, stage lights spinning out of control. In a split second of chaos, he picked up the bottle and hurled it back toward the audience. That bottle hit a 17-year-old girl in the face. Minutes later, the youngest and most ferocious voice of American glam metal was in handcuffs, facing criminal charges, probation, and a compensation payment large enough to wipe out everything he had just earned. The stage he once ruled suddenly became the starting point of a chain of tragedies he could not undo. But Sebastian Bach was never an ordinary man crushed by a single mistake. Before courtrooms and legal trouble, and he had already become the embodiment of a generation. A razor-sharp high voice, long hair, a defiant stare, and songs that made tens of thousands scream along to 18 and Life and Youth Gone Wild. His talent did not come from safe refinement, but from explosive instinct. The very force that lifted him to the top and sent him into free fall. Sebastian Bach's life is a series of unforgiving contrasts. Early success colliding with early punishment, the roar of stadium crowds alongside the silence of courtrooms. A voice born to lead masses, yet a man who repeatedly pushed himself outside the group. Fired from the very band that made him famous through a brief phone call. Losing his family, losing his home, nearly losing his voice. Yet he did not disappear. This story is not just about a reckless rocker. It is the journey of a man who survived his own ego, paid in real pain, and still stood back up to scream before the world again. Sebastian Bach is talent. He is tragedy. So what happens when a voice born to explode must learn how to exist after the lights go out? The moment the glass bottle left Sebastian Bach's hand in 1989 did not come from nowhere. It was not an isolated accident born from one night of lost control, but the delayed consequence of a personality formed very early, from childhood years where discipline, expectation, and instinct constantly clashed. Sebastian Philip Bach was born on April 3, 1968 in Freeport, Bahamas, into a family no stranger to art. His father, David Bach, was a respected painter admired by critics. His mother was a teacher, and the one who kept the household grounded in routine and practicality. Sebastian's childhood unfolded through constant movement, from the Bahamas to California, then to Peterborough, Ontario. Yet the instability he felt did not come from geography, but from the quiet collision of two worlds under the same roof. His father placed unwavering faith in academic achievement, discipline, and prestige. Sebastian, meanwhile, showed early on an energy that refused to stay inside any frame. After his parents' divorce, he lived mainly with his mother, but the presence of his father, and expectations never gently expressed, remained constant. At Lakefield College School, Sebastian performed well academically, yet was equally known for his aggressive temperament and defiant attitude. He did not hide his contempt for rituals, for authority built on formality, or for anyone trying to shape him. That opposition was not loud, but persistent, like a flame waiting to erupt. Music arrived, not as a career choice, but as an escape route. Sebastian consumed rock with the intensity of someone searching for a way out. Kiss, Judas Priest, Rush, voices that were high, sharp, and unapologetic. By his teens, he knew entire albums by heart, mimicking every scream and vocal inflection. When guided toward a prestigious academic path, he chose the opposite. At 15, Sebastian dropped out, left home, and moved to Toronto. No long-term plan, no safety net. Only a still raw but powerful voice and absolute belief that he was not born to live quietly. In Toronto, he played in bar bands where most members were twice his age. His striking height helped him enter spaces not meant for minors. Loud nights, drunk crowds, distorted sound, all of it became his first school. There, Sebastian did not learn restraint. He learned how to occupy space, and from very early on, he grew used to pushing everything to the edge of its limits, a habit that would follow him onto the biggest stages and into the moments that would turn his life in another direction. Toronto was not the place where the turning point happened. It was only the runway. The moment everything truly shifted came from a setting no one considered serious. A wedding. Sebastian Bach was invited to sing at the wedding of rock photographer Mark Weiss, a man familiar with stage lights and the big faces of American hard rock. It was not a staged performance, no contract, no career expectation. Just a young voice placed in a room full of alcohol, laughter, and musicians accustomed to high volume. But right there, when Bach stood up to sing, every boundary of bar singer collapsed instantly. Kevin Dubrow was present. Members of Twisted Sister stood near the makeshift stage. Zakk Wylde appeared with his well-worn guitar. And most importantly, someone saw it, heard it, and remembered a voice that had no instinct for shrinking itself to fit a room. Stories differ about who made the key connections afterward, but they all agree on one thing. From that moment on, a voice once strong enough only to shake club walls was pulled straight toward America, where everything was bigger, faster, and more ruthless. A few weeks later, a cassette tape reached Sebastian. 4 rough demo tracks from Skid Row. No polished production, no decoration, but 2 songs stopped him cold. 18 and Life and Youth Gone Wild. Not because they were perfect, but because they had space. And Bach could hear where his voice could force its way in. He listened again and again, not with the mindset of auditioning, but of taking possession. Melodies that needed to be pushed higher, climaxes that could be torn open with a Rob Halford-style high scream. That ambition did not look like someone asking to join a band. It felt like the reflex of someone who believed a song only truly existed after passing through his throat. The first meeting did not happen in a tidy audition room. They met at Mingles, a rundown club in New Jersey. Drinking, jamming, chaotic sound. And then an insult from the crowd. Sebastian lunged before anyone else could react. A fight broke out on the very first night. Instead of backing away, the band stood beside him. The bond formed not through reason, but through collision. It was the kind of connection that needed no agreement, where standing together in chaos mattered more than any professional promise. And from that moment, the seeds of both glory and disaster were planted at once. A frontman who did not know how to step back, and a group willing to be pulled along at his speed. When Sebastian Bach officially joined Skid Row in 1987 to 1988, his career did not rise along a familiar curve. It launched. Rehearsals stopped being about fitting in and became about controlling the level of destruction. His voice soared so high that the musicians had to pull him down just to keep the structure of the songs from collapsing. Yet that excess became the identity. Skid Row began to carry 2 parallel faces, songs sharp enough for radio, and a vocalist constantly pushing everything to the edge. The success ahead would not be built only on hit singles or label strategy, but on a personality that refused to stay inside limits, the very force that would carry them to historic heights, then tear apart every balance once the wheel started spinning too fast. That momentum of collision did not stop at a rundown club. It was magnified the moment the self-titled debut album Skid Row was released in 1989 under producer Michael Wagner. 3 songs shooting onto the Billboard Hot 100 were not just hits. They split Sebastian Bach into 3 public fragments. Youth Gone Wild unleashed the reckless, defiant edge. 18 and Life dragged him into the dark territory of violence, guilt, and misdirection. "I remember you" forced a voice used to tearing through air to lower itself, soften, and place raw emotion on the wire. At the same time, Skid Row was pushed onto the main road, opening tours for Bon Jovi and Aerosmith. Opening slots quickly turned into moments of takeover. Bach ran, jumped, screamed, pulled arenas toward him, dissolving the boundary of support act. The stage began to carry his name as much as the band's. Then, one December night, the stage truly changed shape. December 27, 1989, Springfield. A seemingly routine show lurched out of control when a glass bottle from the crowd flew straight into Bach's head. The impact did more than hurt. It triggered the same instinct he had carried since cramped Toronto clubs: reflex before reason. Bach picked up the bottle and hurled it back. The glass left his hand in a split second no one could intercept, and when it landed, it struck a 17-year-old girl who had nothing to do with the original throw. Chaos exploded. Bach jumped off the edge of the stage into the crowd, where the line between performance and real life collapsed completely. What followed was no longer drum beats or follow spots. It was sirens, restraint, and the cold silence as the show was cut short. In minutes, Bach's absolute territory became a crime scene. The concert ended with a report. The days after began with charges, court dates, and numbers measured not in decibels, but in legal responsibility. A large settlement, extended probation, and the feeling of being ripped away from a tour that had been running like a machine. For the first time, he understood that the stage, once a place that allowed every exaggeration, could also become evidence. The price was not only money, but rupture. Between reflex and thought, between public image and personal consequence, between a scream that drew cheers and an action that could not be taken back. Yet the fame did not slow. It accelerated along a warped trajectory. By 1990, media mentioned Sebastian Bach's name more than Skid Row's. The focus shifted from songs to the man. On stage, narrative control tilted toward the frontman. Impulsive speeches, spontaneous reinterpretations that left lyric writers feeling their work slipping away. Outside, bigger crowds fed the ego. Inside, the feeling of being swallowed became constant pressure. Tours stretched as if without breaks, recklessness rising with the volume of applause. And every move, every word from Bach left aftershocks the others had to absorb. At that intersection, between lights not yet off and files not yet closed, Skid Row began learning a hard truth. Success could expand faster than their ability to control it. The peak came in 1991 with Slave to the Grind, heavier, harsher, and debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200, a historic milestone for hard rock at the time. The achievement forced the industry to take notice, but even amid celebration, cracks widened. On tour, Bach confronted authority by instinct. At Wembley Arena, reading a warning letter from the local council and still performing "Get the F Out," accepting a regional performance ban as a personal statement, while the band saw long-term risk. At London Docklands, pulling his pants down and wiping himself with a newspaper pushed the image toward self-destruction at the very moment Skid Row needed control to stay balanced. #1 success and zero restraint behavior coexisted in the same year. Between applause and grinding teeth, the shared rope was pulled so tight that one more jerk could snap it. Those fractures did not fade with time. They accumulated, wearing down rehearsals, phone calls, and decisions that once seemed small. By 1996, Skid Row faced a question that sounded purely professional on the surface. Should they take an opening slot for Kiss? For Sebastian Bach, it was opportunity. Massive crowds, familiar stage voltage, and a needed push in a market that had changed seasons. For the others, it signaled unacceptable regression. A band that had stood at the summit should not return to opening for anyone. The argument was not about dates. It struck directly at how each of them imagined their own future. The breaking point arrived over Thanksgiving. A voicemail, short, sharp, and beyond limits, was left when frustration had nowhere else to go. No minutes, no long meeting were needed. On hearing it was enough to know the shared rope had snapped. 2 days before Christmas 1996, the decision came by phone. No stage, no farewell. Just a call ending an era of Skid Row that had been both brilliant and painful. Brilliant because it touched the peak. Painful because it ended in a way no one wanted. The void that followed did not allow Bach to sit still. 1997 opened with a survival question. How to prove he was not only Skid Row's shadow. The first answer was his voice. In 1999, the live album Bring 'Em Bach Alive appeared, largely Skid Row-era songs with some new tracks. A cold assertion that he still stood firm at the microphone, still held range and stamina before crowds. Not a major commercial turn, but a necessary statement to keep the thread with the audience from breaking. Then Bach changed arenas. In 2000, he stepped onto Broadway in the lead role of Jekyll and Hyde. No metal lights, no amp stacks, only stage rhythm, dialogue, and strict discipline. That contrast forced him to relearn control, not to become less intense, but to place intensity where it belonged. In 2001, the Rocky Horror Show opened another door, where performance energy transformed into physicality and character. In 2002, touring Jesus Christ Superstar carried him through halls, demanding emotional nuance rather than explosion. In 2004, returning to Jekyll and Hyde tested again his ability to stand outside the Skid Row shell. In parallel, he stayed in mainstream flow another way. In 2002, he hosted VH1's Forever Wild, a field change to remain visible when radio and MTV had turned away from glam metal. Not a comfortable compromise, but a survival strategy, stepping outside the familiar frame to avoid disappearing. At each stage, Bach battled the pain of losing his old identity while sharpening a new one, where the voice remained central but no longer shielded by a band's name. Between different lights, he learned to move forward without anyone lifting him onto a stage. The turns that followed were not smooth. In 2003, as post-grunge waves and supergroups were seen as lifelines for classic rock, Sebastian Bach entered another audition room, this time for Velvet Revolver. It was not just a vocal test, but an identity test. He sang with the familiar instinct, high, sharp, thick, the sound that once lifted tens of thousands. Yet that very tone closed the door. The reason was blunt. The blend sounded like Skid Roses, not because he sang poorly, but because Skid Row's shadow was too large. Anything he touched carried memories of an era. Velvet Revolver chose Scott Weiland, and Bach left with a clearer equation than ever. If he could not separate himself from the past through a new band, he would have to do it through his own music. The solo path stopped being optional. It became survival strategy. And through long touring years, vocal therapy, learning breath control so one explosive night would not cost the future, Bach began laying foundations again. In 2011, Kicking and Screaming arrived, a record not trying to modernize through trends, nor avoiding the metal grain etched into his voice. It showed an important reality. Solo could run on its own, without Skid Row's jacket. Songs were built around a changed range, less showmanship, more weight, like a seasoned driver choosing safer lines to go farther. 3 years later, Give 'Em Hell, 2014, kept the fire through structured singles and videos. Not a media storm, but enough to keep Sebastian Bach out of the nostalgia drawer. The music now reflected a different stance, fierce but calculated, knowing when to stop to keep going. Each recording session was a negotiation with the body, where to hold pitch, where to release, so the voice would not turn traitor. The 2023s opened a new chapter. When many assumed he would remain in festival loops and familiar set lists, Bach returned with a new studio album, Child Within the Man, 2024. No rush, no fixed lineup. He invited multiple guest guitarists, so each song carried different energy, like assembling fragments of different eras into one present. And the record was received as a direct reminder. People still wanted to hear Bach for that voice, imperfect, no longer young, but carrying the truth of someone who had walked through enough loss to know what to preserve. Alongside the album came a new tour, where old songs stood beside new ones not as concession, but as dialogue. On stage, Bach no longer needed to prove how long he could scream. He needed to prove what story he could still tell with that voice. And on nights where the highs were placed precisely and the lows held longer, the equation of saving the voice stopped being technical anxiety. It became artistic choice, keeping the road ahead open. In the early years of his solo path, when tour schedules had thinned but his mind had not yet settled, Sebastian Bach was not walking alone. Long before Skid Row reached their peak, he had met Maria Aquinar, a woman outside the spotlight, who entered his life in the late 1980s, when Bach was still a young singer living between tour buses, studios, and sleepless nights. The relationship formed early, before fame became a burden, before the name Sebastian Bach was magnified beyond his own control. In 1992, while Bach remained a stage icon of a generation, and Skid Row still stood in the glow of Slave to the Grind, he and Maria married. On the surface, it was a rare image of stability in a rock life built on impermanence. Maria did not step into the role of a rock star's wife with noise or spectacle. She chose to stand behind the scenes, unholding the rhythm of the household, while her husband lived most of his time in airports, backstage corridors, and hotel rooms. They had 3 children, and for years Bach tried to sustain 2 parallel worlds, a father returning home after tours, and a frontman carrying the aftershock of the stage even after the front door closed. That rhythm was never balanced. After leaving Skid Row, income grew less stable, pressure to maintain his name grew heavier, and his presence at home remained fragmented. Maria carried the stability Bach could not provide during the years he struggled to redefine his place. Long tours, patchwork projects, and the psychological volatility of someone accustomed to high intensity widened the distance without the need for open conflict. The family existed, but always in a state of adjustment to absence. Not only physical, but emotional. By 2010, after nearly 2 decades together, the marriage ended in a relatively quiet divorce. No public legal spectacle, no open accusations, just the late acknowledgement that 2 people had moved too far from the point where they could hold each other in place. For Bach, it was a loss unfolding alongside other fractures. His old band belonged to the past. The music market no longer held space for the kind of star he once was, and the familiar home was no longer intact. His 3 children remained the thread connecting him, but his role now had to change. Less impulsive, more aware of what absence leaves behind. That collapse did not stand apart from what came before. It lay on the same axis as standing alone after Skid Row, as the effort to keep his voice, his stage presence, his identity, when familiar supports fell away one by one. In the silence of private life, Bach faced a reality far removed from the roar of crowds, things that could not be fixed with a good song or a successful show. From that void, the path ahead took on a different rhythm, slower, heavier, without the illusion that everything could be burned without leaving ash. Personal losses did not end with the breakdown of a family. In 2011, while Sebastian Bach was still balancing tours and studio work, a storm erased the place he called home. Hurricane Irene did more than tear the roof from his New Jersey house. It swept away the archive of memory he had carried all his life. The hand-recorded Skid Row-era cassettes, unpublished photographs, old letters, and the Kiss memorabilia he had treasured since adolescence, all vanished into water and mud. This was no longer a story of property. It was personal history ripped from the ground, forcing a man who lived through stage memories to face a void that money or applause could not fill. When Bach spoke of starting over, it was not a slogan. It was the feeling of standing before a life split in two, where the past no longer existed to lean on. That reordering led him toward another rhythm of living. In August 2015, Bach married Suzanne Lay. Without spectacle, without loud declarations, the relationship carried a new order, less impulsive, less driven by the need to prove anything through noise. They moved to Las Vegas, leaving New Jersey and the landscapes that evoked too much of a former life. Paradoxically, the desert city brought a sense of structure, clearer schedules, protected privacy, a life not constantly pulled backward by old addresses. With his children, Bach chose measured presence, not imposing fame, not pushing ambition onto the next generation. He remained close enough to protect, distant enough not to repeat the cycles that had cost him dearly. His body, meanwhile, allowed no complacency. Years of screaming at extreme intensity left visible marks. In 2017, Bach underwent surgery related directly to prolonged singing and shouting, a reminder that the voice is not only a professional asset, but an organ pushed to its edge. After surgery, everything became more calculated, choosing pitch, distributing energy, placing emotion where needed, rather than burning through an entire song. Saving the voice stopped being purely technical. It became life discipline, the way an artist learns to respect the body that carried him through countless nights. In the quieter days of Las Vegas, between rehearsals and carefully structured tour schedules, Bach continued forward, not with his former intensity, but with the endurance of someone who understands that to keep singing, one must know when to stop. As life moves into 2025, the rhythm does not begin with an explosion, but with deliberate continuation. After Child, Within the Man was released and carried on to stages throughout the previous year, Sebastian Bach enters the new year with a more carefully chosen performance schedule. No longer endless grinding tours, he appears at stops that feel like reunions, where audiences come not to test how many high notes he can still hit, but to hear a voice shaped by years place weight back into every line. The new songs remain intact in spirit, yet the live delivery has changed. Less display, more control, breath calculated as part of performance structure rather than instinctive reflex. Nostalgia rock festivals continue to call his name, not as a shadow of a past decade, but as an emotional anchor for the generation that grew up with late 80s MTV. On those stages, Bach stands between two timelines. Behind him, 18 and Life, I Remember You. Ahead, newer songs that still carry grit, but no longer aggression. Each show becomes a careful adjustment between memory and present, between a name once tied to a band that is no longer his, and the solo road he has carried alone for years. Off stage, his media presence stays measured. Conversations revolve around preserving the voice, accepting physical limits, and living with legacy without being consumed by it. The need to shock through words or behavior has faded. He speaks about the craft as long-term work, where the voice is not only a performance tool, but something to be protected daily. In that rhythm, 2025 passes as a year of steadiness, not loud, not retreating, simply continuing to place that voice where it can still exist. The legacy of Sebastian Bach does not lie in how long he stood at the peak, but in how he shaped a type of frontman late 20th century hard rock had not seen before. Before Bach, glam metal had image, melody, and flash. After Bach, it had a scream carrying dramatic weight, real danger, and an energy that made the stage less a place of performance than emotional detonation. Recordings like 18 and Life, Youth Gone Wild, and Slave to the Grind endure not only through hooks or choruses, but through the way Bach's voice pushed each story to the edge of listener endurance, high, raw, fragile, as if any note might break. That influence spread wider than often acknowledged. A generation of early 90s hard rock and metal singers learned from Bach not merely how to sing high, but how to place emotion into risk, daring to let the voice approach loss of control in exchange for truth. Even when glam metal collapsed under grunge, what remained was not long hair or leather pants, but memory of a voice that made audiences believe rock could be both violent and tragic at once. That legacy is deeply personal as well. Bach became a rare example of an artist not protected by the myth of dying young, not frozen in a beautiful moment and preserved there. He had to live on with consequences, removed from the band that made his name, constantly compared to his own past, forced to prove worth in a music world that no longer needed him as before. Broadway roles, solo albums, surgeries, and vocal therapy were not expansion. They were protection of identity. I am still a singer, even if the era has turned away. If there is one reason Sebastian Bach is still spoken of today, it is not scandal or recklessness, but the persistent presence of a voice that survived the intensity it created. He did not become an icon through perfection, but by paying real cost for each moment at the top. That lack of safety in the voice, and choices in existence, is what keeps his name from being filed away as nostalgia. When the opening guitar of 18 and Life rings out, people do not only remember a song, they remember the first time they heard a singer scream as if there were no tomorrow. What moment of Sebastian Bach stays with you the longest? Share in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring rock lives told beyond simple glory, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.